Welcome to the Hedge podcast, hosted by Michael Watson.
All right, and welcome back to another episode of the Hedge podcast. I'm your host, Michael Watson, where we talk about technology, data, and AI within asset managers and hedge funds. So for today's episode, we had two awesome guests once again. We had Dan Entrup from Agnowledge, who's a founder working on expert network curation, like how you can go about creating data sets and think about data strategy within asset management, hedge funds, corporates, you name it. And he's been deep in the weeds for like almost a decade now, thinking through what does it mean of building data products, selling data product, and getting insight for asset managers. And he's now deep in the weeds of what does that mean in the world of AI, which segues us into our next guest, Freeman Lewin, founder of BrickRoad, where they're building an agentic marketplace for agents to purchase data. And one of the things that I found really interesting there is that he originally started the company by selling data, a data marketplace to frontier labs that were using data for both inference as well as model training. And the way that he described what that data procurement process is like to sell to researchers within frontier labs was an exact replica of what my experience is, or at least was, selling data within the hedge fund space in the mid 2010s, late 2010s. And that workflow is actually quite similar. And I think that the way that data is starting to be used and thought of within frontier labs isn't too dissimilar from the way that data is thought in the hedge fund and market making industry. And as AI starts getting more integrated within financial markets, capital allocation, that the way information is purchased, consumed, and integrated is going to start blending between what it looks like in frontier labs and finance in an interesting way. And I think that he had some really interesting thoughts on that. Some other areas that we touched on in this episode were around what is the role of selling to agents versus selling to people. And Dan had some really good concepts around people think about data always being bought, but there's also an element of selling. And what does that mean within an AI world? And then I started touching on everything that's going on within the Anthropic ecosystem, specifically around the rollout of Claude Cowork, the alignment with Claude Code within desktop. There's now Claude Remote, there's Claude Mobile, there's Claude Code on your machine. And what does the plugin ecosystem look like that Anthropic's starting to create so that you can distribute skills, expert knowledge, best practices through what's starting to become the Apple App Store, except for enterprise through Anthropic Marketplace. Awesome conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. And with that, let's get into the episode. Dan and I were actually data influencers on a panel, kind of funny term to call us, but that's what they named the panel, at Battlefin in Miami, maybe like a month ago. And the panel was awesome, and we figured we might as well do an episode of the podcast just to continue on.
I think we had like another hour or two left in the tank to keep going. But they had to cut us off for drinks. So excited to continue the conversation here.
Exactly. And so we got all the time in the studio. So
I have a pinned tweet on my Twitter about data influencers and how I think that they will be the new type of influencers going forward. It's about a year old and it still hasn't existed, but there's a whole world of people on Reddit that are creating data sets for ML training, which is super interesting.
Yeah, my favorite joke from the event was letting everyone know that us on stage were probably not the influencers that everyone was expecting when they were in Miami.
Oh yeah, the South Beach influencers, you don't necessarily picture these two faces showing up on the screen. But that's interesting, like how you're talking about like a year ago of data influencers being like the next role within the data industry, the way that you market information. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that the data industry is bifurcated between your guys' world, which is hedge funds and financial services and AI. I think my company, we started I would say I started selling data about 2 years ago in earnest, and we've always focused on selling data to AI and ML companies. And the ICP for that buyer is totally different from somebody like that you guys focus on, in the sense that we are almost solely dedicated to reaching and talking to engineers and researchers. Whereas for you guys, I think I would suspect that your primary point of contact is data strategists. Would that be right?
Yeah, and I think, actually, so when Freeman and I met, I think one of the things I was really intrigued about with his business was that you weren't just selling to that market. And I think when I've talked a lot about data commerce overall and the different use cases, like hedge funds are one niche of it. And even within hedge funds, you have so many different types of strategies. You have active, you have passive management, you have systematic, you have fundamental. Like there's all these different ways to kind of cohort it and break it down. And I think there's nuances for each of those. Some people think about how the data is getting used and also how it's being bought and sold. And so I think, overall, we've had some great chats. I've been, excited to be talking here today and sort of share some of those learnings about what are the similarities and what are the differences along the way, targeting those different markets and use cases.
Yeah. I think the data space in the ML world is in a pretty sorry state of affairs, in the sense that if you wanted to sell data to one of the big foundational models, you would be primarily if you wanted to do it the right way, you would be expending a huge amount of capital to make a sample data set, put it on Hugging Face, put it on BrickRoad, try to go through this product-led growth strategy, and then maybe somebody in a financial strategy or partnerships at one of the big labs would reach out to you, hopefully. um, I think that's indicative of all the labs, is there's really no data strategy person on hand at these labs, and so our job is to create the tools so that somebody coming in that might not have 10 years of data strategy at a hedge fund can come into the labs and be a good data strategist using our tools.
Really cool. So like Dan and I are probably familiar with, or definitely Dan, familiar with how the data industry, buyers, sellers works within asset management, capital markets. I guess I have no idea how it works within machine learning, AI labs that are actually training models, thinking through this. What does that relationship, that marketplace look like?
Yeah, so the way that a data deal starts in this space is a researcher engineer has a need, and they go out on the internet and look for a data set, look for or see something on Twitter or see something trending on Hugging Face, and then they ask their middle management person, whether that's financial strategy or a new data strategy position at a robotics lab, or it's a CEO, or it's a partnerships person, middle management generally, that doesn't really have the know-how
Yeah.
that somebody like you guys have, to go out and source that data set from that person. And then that person, it's a series of emails back and forth. I will say, like, we did a big deal with one of the foundational models, and I just looked through my emails, and it took 83 emails back and forth, about 6 months. And that that's too long for a researcher or engineer at a lab. So it usually goes to the middle management, and then every single turn of the data goes back to researcher engineer. They validate it. They do a little bit of testing against it, and then the biggest part of the process is the negotiation, on the legal, which I think is probably very similar to you guys. But negotiations on legals in this space, from what I understand, is a little bit different from you guys, in the sense that, like, the big labs will try to really bully, and we've had a situation where one of the labs was tried to get an indemnity and release for all of their investors and all of their customers. Uh,
Yeah,
w-
but it's not too dissimilar from some of the data sourcing teams from the larger multi-strats.
right, right.
Um,
And so we're increasingly seeing a world where our technology is being tested within the hedge funds and multi-strats. But um, I guess the primary difference is that there's no dedicated data strategists on a lot of these teams. And then the better world is that there's really very little diligence.
yeah, but just to add to that,
Yeah.
the big firms have figured this out through trial and error. The majority of asset managers and hedge funds out there do not have a dedicated data strategist, and they don't have a procurement process and like a formal legal review process. They kind of figure it out ad hoc.
Right.
That's where
Yeah, and sometimes those things are disconnected, like data strategy from the actual procurement process of data and the budgeting of it and sort of the financial component. And, I think if I'm to sum up where I feel like I've become like a scholar of just like evaluating and thinking about it in my own time, it is a lot of that. It's the seller persona and the buyer persona and where they meet. And some of that is the forum that they meet, like they can meet on a BrickRoad. And others is just how are they actually interacting with each other. And so my last large corporate job before starting Acknowledge, I was head of data strategy at a Fortune 500 company, and people came to me all the time with really the wrong sales process. It was, so what's your budget for data? And I'm like, that is such a loaded question. And also I don't just sit on this data purchasing budget. And I think that where I typically saw that was when people were used to selling to hedge funds. But even then they limited themselves. Like they weren't selling to every different type of strategy hedge fund. They usually kind of had this group of like 30 funds that did operate very similarly and had these defined roles where they had a data strategist who also oversaw the procurement element. And that doesn't mean that I didn't buy data. It's just my role was not just to take a budget and go out and say, what's the best price? Who are the 5 vendors that I can get? It was really defining like what is that strategy overall. And I actually likened it to corporate strategy with a focus on data as like the key driver, as opposed to just data strategy and thinking about like the movement of ones and zeros along the way. But
Yeah. I think that focus is also an interesting, difference, because the AI labs are not necessarily making money off of the data that they procure. And a lot of people think that some of the foundational labs have infinite amount of money, which they do. They have a good amount of money, but they're also spending a crap ton of money.
Yeah.
And the million photos that they buy from from XYZ person is not going to move the needle on how their model performs, and it's also not going to make them more money. So like a year ago, a lot of the labs, to your question, whether it's for training or inference, a year ago, actually, a lot of the labs were buying data to CYA, in the sense that they were just buying data from people that they might have stolen from,
Mm-hmm.
or just wanted to cover their ass for other reasons. But the motivations for buying data are radically different from a lab than a
Where do you think we're at on that curve of like, I think particularly the news organizations
Yeah.
and media was filing lawsuits, and then all of a sudden an announcement would come out that they entered into a licensing agreement. But do you think that we're large when it comes to like the open internet and news media? Where are we past the hump there, or do you think that there's more to come?
I don't think we'll ever be past the hump of models scraping. I think that the arrangements are going to be radically different, and they already are. A lot of the models, from what I hear in the space, are using scrapers that will indemnify them for future lawsuits. And there's always going to be a dependency um, on current resources, and there's always going to be a want not to have to pay for it, right? So I think you will probably get to a point where it really depends on your efforts, really, in the sense that like the enterprise adoption of these models needs to really ramp up in a big way, because and the enterprises need to come and say, hey, we want to have an identification that you guys aren't using scrape data in a nefarious way, or something like that. We saw that the original, like the first tread to fall was the Figma rollback of their AI models, which were very much taking creative works from other people, and it was very obvious of that and they had to roll it back. Um, but I think until there's a really clear business use case, I think that the models will still need to rely on scrape data. Um, uh, it will just be the delivery mechanisms will be different. It won't be delivery of nodes like some scrapers do, but actually delivery of data. and those scrapers will actually have to identify them to be able to have a deal done.
Interesting.
But there is also licensing of what used to be considered proprietary or internal data that starts having a gray mark. Like Salesforce has now license rules that you can't distill data that you're pulling from a Salesforce product into a model, whether it's through a third party or internal. So that includes Slack messages. So can you take your own internal Slack messages, extract them, and then fine tune your own model on top of that? And so like there's now all this other data that you used to see like, oh, that's not relevant for this conversation from a licensing perspective. But as everyone's starting to put up their moats and figuring out what is our path forward in this like AI world, that even data that you used to assume, at least if you're an enterprise, is yours, isn't necessarily the case if you want to use it for distilling or fine tuning into your own model. So it's not
Yeah.
just open internet data or like third party data that you're getting from scrapes. It's even data that you already might even assume is yours. And that's not necessarily the case.
There's a legendary story of a company, a very large video communications company, a meeting company that thought that they had rights to sell their meeting conversations to another foundational model. And then the foundational model thankfully looked into the terms and conditions and was like, no, the companies that are on that call, they have those rights to sell it. You guys don't have wholesale rights. Um, I think that we're at a convergence. So there's a world in my space called data-centric machine learning. And that is the idea that you can have that augmenting an algorithm has it has a peak. You can't, at some point you can't augment the algorithm more, but what you can do to improve the model is to add better data. That has always been on the back burner to algorithmic data models or algorithmic AI. Um, as of the last like 48 hours, I think that's probably, I think that data-centric AI is going to uh, be increasingly in focus because the models are shutting down their open weights. They're shutting down, they're closing ranks because of distillation, because everybody's relying on them. And now they're closing ranks, and as a result, the only way to make great models is to have better data. So you've got these two processes. You've got, the Slacks are not letting you train on your own data, and then you've got the models that are not letting people train on and use their models effectively. And now you're gonna have a world where you have to reimagine the pipeline, the supply pipeline of both weights and biases and data. I think it's a really exciting time for data, especially.
Totally. And where we're seeing the most amount of impact for our end is we focus on how do we fine tune tokens instead of fine tuning weights.
Yeah.
Because the quality of the weights right now and the state of our commercial models are so far beyond what they need to be to add a tremendous amount of value right now that it's more up to how do you want to construct your tokens in order to get the most value out of that. Because getting better weights right now doesn't move the needle nearly as much as just getting better tokens. And when I say tokens, I mean, how do you combine your internal knowledge? Like, how do you get a user to be able to effectively interact with the system? How do you start structuring data and information so that the model can easily access it via agentic loops? And there's many frameworks around that. And then lastly, how do you start structuring organizational knowledge around something like skills or optimize? And I consider these optimized tokens for inference in a way that that's accessible to everyone in the organization. And using that as what your North Star is, at least for right now, kind of bypasses the need of fine tuning and distillation and getting your own model in a place that it's really needle moving, because it's so much easier right now to optimize and fine tune your tokens. And there's a lot of value to be able to find it. No one's stopping you from that either. Like, that's not a licensing issue. No one's saying you can't use these tokens and this data for inference, because you still are required to license that data at inference time, or otherwise they cut it off.
I think optimization, whether it's on the token side or it's on the data side, is probably the most interesting space for at least for me. Less interesting is putting a data center, but putting a data center in New Jersey so it hits New York faster.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I did that in my past career. It's not that interesting. More interesting is like, how do you optimize so that a model picks the best data to ingest for the best result? And that's what we're building. We call it, our utility scoring mechanism, and token optimization. Also, is like, how do you make it so that you're saving money, off of something that is pretty well done already.
So let's talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit in terms of how you provide a data search platform or a marketplace of data per se. It seems as though you're actually providing that more for an agent than you are for a person, and allowing the agent to make that determination of what data is necessary or available. And I'm just showing a little bit more about your company. I'd love for you to describe a little more. What is go to market for you? Well, who are you building product for? Are you building product for an agent, or are you building a product for a person? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, Dan and I were talking about this in the bathroom before this. But
As you, yeah, even it's all days, all times I need is
one does
was it stall to stall?
hand holding. And um, eh, it's an interesting question. I think to start out though, the basis is the framing of it needs to start from this principle: the data doesn't sell itself. Dan taught me that years ago. I love it. Um, a lot of people start in this space with idea that they are going to create a marketplace for people, um, or they're going to create a data marketplace, and you can like slice and dice it however you want. You can create a product directory. You can do IDOs and have a daily email. You can um, you, you can put data sets online and see if people are going to buy it. Um, the number one thing is, though, the data doesn't sell itself, especially to humans. And as a result, no, a human's not going to buy a $20,000 or even a $10,000 data or even $10 data set on their own. There's no like pressure, there's no impetus. And we're working on some, bid mechanisms to put a little bit of pressure on the human side. But for us, we focus on agents. We think that agents are going to be buying small subsets of data over and over and over again. Take, for example, an agent that is tasked with uh, executive assistant agent that's tasked with booking somebody a flight. That agent is going to need to know the weather. They're going to need to know the traffic patterns. They're going to need to know what the preferences are for the user, etc. Now, some of those things are like one time, you can just put it into preferences. But if an agent is tasked with buying a flight, and they know that the user doesn't like to sit in the car for an hour to get to JFK, they need to get to on time. They're going to have to know, okay, this is the weather on this day, and they're going to ask it over and over again because God forbid something happens to the weather, they're going to need to change the flight, for example. That's a okay example, but there's other examples you can do. The bottom line is, though, that a human EA, could be wrong, right? We allow humans to be wrong and have context, and they have great context, and we allow them to be wrong. But we won't trust an agent if they are wrong one time. So an agent is going to have to buy data sets or subsets of data sets over and over again. And that's why we built for agent. We built it so that agents can discover data sets, agents can buy data sets, data can sell itself to agents. That's our thesis.
Yeah, and actually, just kind of going off of that, so it was a podcast back in early 2023 that I did, where I said, and I didn't come up with this notion, but I said I ascribe to the notion that data is sold, it's not bought. And I kind of explained what I meant by that, but I think one of the important things was I said, I don't really think it should be that way. In a lot of markets, when you actually have an efficient exchange or marketplace, people don't define things so much as it's either bought or it's sold. Like, people don't just say, financial securities are only sold, they're not bought. Like, they're both. And depending how you want to define that, you have buyers and sellers, and you have a forum and a bunch of forums where they can actually transact. But the actual mechanics of the infrastructure over the past few years, and going prior to that statement leading up to saying that I ascribed to that notion, was that the infrastructure wasn't actually there to enable efficient data buying. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about is, whether it is human driven or agentic, and I agree with you on, when an agent gets something wrong once, people kind of shut the entire thing down. But I see humans make mistakes all the time. And having been even with Acknowledge, and we're a data management and enrichment service. We help people who know where they want to be going sometimes. Hopefully. If not, I can tell them where I think they should be going. And um but they don't really know how to get there. And they've never bought data before. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what nuances to look for. They don't necessarily have the technical chops. And so we stitch together so much of that for them so that they don't have to do that. They don't have to be thinking about people data separate from company data, separate from vendor data. At the end of the day, their goal is to identify people with relevant experience and expertise to opine on a certain topic and speak to one of their clients, and they need to do that as quickly as possible and in the most compliant manner as possible. Uh, their their business is not set up to buy data. And there's just so many things that I think they find along the way when they do. Like, credit to everyone who goes and tries, but what we usually see happens is they go and they buy one data set, and they've locked up all budget that they were able to get. It took forever to be able to get that one data set, and that one data set doesn't actually solve the problem.
Yeah.
That one data set may only 10% of the data may actually be really valuable, and you need to go and figure out where the other 90% of that comes from. And so that's a big part of the Acknowledge thesis, is we will do that for people so that they don't have to do that. But I believe I agree with you of like this sort of agentic purchasing. I think we are at a point now where we will start to see a shift where data can be bought, or at least it's not so polarizing to be saying that, data is sold, it's not bought. There's a happy medium and an efficient exchange.
Yeah, and within that context, what does that look like? What does a world where a machine can buy data look like? A bunch of things have to happen. In my mind, the primary thing outside of technology is that businesses, suppliers need to be ready to sell on a consumption basis. And right now, like most of the incumbents in the space, the long-standing leaders in data supply space, just are not in a position to do it. Their infrastructure is there for, sales teams and SDRs, and I don't think that bodes well.
I mean, I think when there's a will, there's a way, and
Yep.
unfortunately, there's just no will. And we talked about this on the panel. Of a lot of it comes down to command and control, and a lot of management teams are very uncomfortable with the idea that they don't know every single thing about that customer, and to the point where I think it largely has gotten in the way of selling. Plus, when you look at, I never want to say like SaaS is dead, and don't hear me say that. Although if I were to open my LinkedIn feed right now, there'd be about 15 posts that would say SaaS is dead with everything going on in the market. But so many of these businesses were set up uh, kind of mid 2010s, raise venture funding under the premise that they would be a SaaS business and that everything was going to be hyper scalable, but like they had long-term recurring sort of bulk, six-figure contracts. And this model breaks from that. And I don't think a lot of people have really thought through well, how much business am I not getting because I had, say, $100,000 minimum on a single data set? How many opportunities have I not been able to get? Had I broken that barrier, would I probably retain the people who are actually using the data? I think absolutely. And then, how many more would the aggregate add up to more? I think the answer is largely yes. And I'm excited to see that. I think there's a big opportunity for correction for the people who are gonna kind of take that bull by the horns and look at this as this could be a tremendous commerce opportunity for the data asset owners. They have to do it right. They have to think about all the questions. They have to talk to the right people to do it. But I do believe, and you spoke on a panel the other day where I think over 50% of the crowd raised their hand and said consumption-based data they believe is the future. And that was on both the seller and the buyer side. But that is a very new shift once I think people started to have to break away from what their VC backers were telling them was how they needed to run their business and their accounting.
What about your client? Do you think that in your world, do you think that consumption base would be something that would be interested in?
100%.
Yeah.
I see that Claude Cowork, Claude Code, Claude like code mapped within desktop, even Cursor for technical users, but really like what Claude Cowork is just now doing with building agents accessible to the enterprise, building the plugin marketplace, which is for me the new iPhone or the App Store for iOS, except now for enterprise customers via the lens of AI, that the ability for enterprise customers that would be using agents, building agents that are then going to be able to use consumption-based interfaces to trial, test, back test, identify if there's a potential ROI within a workflow in a matter of like minutes, just let the agentic loop go, is going to be available to a customer base that is 10 times, maybe 100 times the size of the current funds and asset managers that currently have the resources to go through that process, that it's going to be a no-brainer. Everyone's going to have an AI data scientist by the end of 2026 that's an Anthropic enterprise customer. And that AI data scientist needs a mechanism to be able to hypothesis test, have trial and error, follow some sort of a scientific method that's very well understood right now, in order to give the user that is delegating work to that agent the best insights on the different names in research processes they're trying to better understand.
One thing I want to add is like consumption-based doesn't mean cheaper.
Well,
No,
It actually usually means that
it's more
at a lower tier is
Yeah.
a lot more expensive.
but it's less risk.
I think it is less risk. It allows people to get started much quicker. It allows them to not have to go through, talk to a salesperson, and nothing against salespeople, but like their time should be focused on those larger enterprise relationships where someone does already know that they have a massive need to buy like an entire data set, and let everyone else who wants to dip their toe in that could ramp up into one of those customers be the one that does that. I mean, it's like any other business. Like you can buy toilet paper and paper towels at Costco for a lot cheaper than if you buy, when you buy them in bulk, than if you buy a 2-pack at the local grocery store or bodega in New York. And but people want both. Like there are times where I'm like, I don't have time to go to a wholesale place. Like
totally.
and I'm out of paper towels, and I go and I pay that premium, and I know I pay that premium. Or if I wanted to try out something new, I would rather pay a premium from a unit economic standpoint to buy that and try it out. So yeah, I just kind of want to throw that out there, that I think there's a big misunderstanding for a lot of people that consumption based means it's like a race to the bottom on pricing, or that they won't, they'll affect their average contract value. But there's also mechanisms to work around that too from an accounting standpoint, especially if you're working with a platform, and the platform is ultimately one that's writing the check at the end of the day and aggregating all those small relationships.
And the same thing exists within cloud, right? You can pay per compute, or you can get reserved instances. You can go to AWS, GCP, Azure, and commit to a minimum spend at the end of the year. And they're more than happy for that because that smooths out their cash flow cycles. They don't all necessarily want the fact they're getting more money, but it could be a little bit more spiky. And once a consumer kind of understands what their spending behavior looks like, you can then have more informed purchasing decisions that actually smooth that spend over time, that finds what that equilibrium is between the buyer and seller, more so than like a single fixed rate for everyone, or a discrimination process where the salesperson is trying to ask what's the most I can get, and the buyers try to say what's the least I can spend. So it actually allows for an efficient market equilibrium that will eventually look like a subscription-like model with minimum commitments, because that's what you see everywhere else. That's not a new concept, but it just, that initial segue into that is a little bit more spiky, but it's possible the people that do it first are going to see that spike, and then they're going to see it smooth out. You might also see like first movers see that initial spike and then fast followers where people see they're losing a little bit of business, and like it's not that hard. To your point, Freeman, like it does require to re-engineer like your revenue model, the subscription model, the economics of the business, but it doesn't have to completely change the entire organization, does it?
What?
No,
Not
not at all.
I'd throw the question out there, and I want to hear your thought. Like, what if you don't? Like, I think there's a question of what if you don't change your model, and 3 years from now, is your business even in existence?
Yeah.
So I think some people are being forced.
Also the cost to switch over to make this available while keeping your sales team and keeping. Say you want to sell to AI labs, but you are patently in this space where you're selling to financial services. You can do both. It's not hard to spin up an agent or tap into BrickRoad and spin and have our agents look at your catalog. It's literally $9 a month in agent fees. Like it's really not hard to explore this space. And to be fair, it might take a little bit to. AI labs and agents will start buying are already buying, but like,
do you think this is where price discrimination comes into play, or like we've talked about, like you've talked about the spot market for data,
yeah,
and like having an established market price that's transparent. um I think there's a little bit of fear for a lot of people that just another anecdote we had is like you take 10 hedge funds buying the exact same data product, they're paying 10 different prices for it. And because a lot of it is that dialogue of how much can we get from them, and then the buyer saying how little can I pay. And so I'm curious your thoughts on like, is there still a fear? Is the fear that pricing becomes transparent and that the people paying the most are going to want to pay less as a result? Or do you think that it's different and distinct enough in terms of the use cases and the value to the end user that the data could be priced differently? Or does that not matter, because if it's just consumption based, the people who need the most are going to buy the most, and the people who just
in theory, the people that buy the most need the data the most are going to buy the most, and it should line up pretty quickly. The greatest fear that I think that established suppliers have is that um, um, their customers, on the hedge fund side especially, their customers are hedge funds. They sell to hedge funds. Now, if we decide to sell to an AI lab, what if their analyst at the hedge fund goes out and uses Claude and gets our data? That's like, and now has no need for us, for example. Or that's like a real fear. And it's hard to address that one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how do you address that?
Yeah, just don't sell. Like a lot of it is sell for inference purposes, not for training.
Yeah, don't sell for training.
Just what the rights are.
Yeah, and it comes down to rights, and whether you believe or trust the counterparty is a different story, and you should have a conversation with me or your lawyer about that. But
you are my lawyer. Yeah.
10 tokens.
Freeman is a lawyer.
Yeah.
I do frequently. Awesome.
So to the spot market thing, though, to just like to lay it out all on the table. Okay, you have consumption-based pricing. You have renewed API model that can support all these calls, because that's a big issue itself. But how do you create a fairer market and a more vibrant and the terminal list talks about more just an open market for data in the sense that a lot of other markets are. That's what we're working on. So just to step back a little bit, BrickRoad, we call ourselves a frontier data lab, in the sense that we started out trying to build for data liquidity. And then we realized on day zero that you needed infrastructure for data liquidity. And when we talk about data liquidity, we talk about suppliers being able to leverage their data against loans or insurance or access, in our case, the DeFi ecosystem. And we think that the golden goose is this world where suppliers will be incentivized to lower the price of their data, or make their data more available so that they can access different liquidity mechanisms. And in turn, AI labs and information services and financial labs will want to buy more data because it's cheaper and in many cases hasn't been on the market before. So we built every transaction that we go is recorded on chain, and as a result, over time, we'll have like a pretty good history of what data transactions have happened, what the spot market for your photo is, etc. Um, but I think that like when we talk about consumption-based pricing, we also have to think about the future. Okay, you're going to have a huge amount of supply come on that wasn't previously available. Mom and pop startups can finally sell to AI labs, for example. And then what's the next future? Okay, the next future is the price of data goes down. That's a big fear for people. So when you talk about talk about price transparency, I think a lot of people are scared of the price of data going down. And I don't look at it that way. I think that the price of data might go down, but if you have the mechanisms to influence or reward suppliers for selling data, there's a good market.
Yeah, and I mean, there's in any commodity market, you have not discover. You have an established price, and you have availability.
Yeah.
And commodity prices go up and down, but they don't all just race to zero just because they're available
Right.
and commoditized.
Right.
So I think that I agree with you. I think there's probably an element of there are probably some data sets where people think that they are worth more than they actually are. There's actually like a long history of that I don't think has corrected itself, particularly when it comes to data monetization from corporations and people sitting on data assets, especially with the hedge fund community. Like a lot of people think, oh, hedge funds, like they'll each pay me $1 million for my data, and there's 4,000 hedge funds out there.
Yeah.
It's going to be a $4 billion line item. I almost say it like humorously and sarcastically, but like there are some consulting firms that are out there pitching that thesis to corporations.
More and more.
We get them
Yeah.
to do this, and you're right. It's increasing that, and then either the price comes down, or someone's kind of set up to fail already from the beginning on that, which just goes back to like talking to the right people. I mean, my whole career has been focused on knowledge networks, and I started off in expert networks, which connect people with subject matter expertise and experience, I think, is also the other big word. So we talked about influencers in the beginning. You have influence, but you also have expertise, but you also have experience. And experience is actually like one of the key things that I think gets underweighted sometimes in a lot of conversations, particularly, people like to be branded as an influencer and influential, or they like to be the subject matter expert or the world's leading expert. But sometimes just someone who's gone through the process before, for good or for bad, who doesn't think of themselves as an expert in something, is the one that actually has the information that is going to best inform your next best action. And actually, I'm interested in your take on skills. Because I know, and admittedly, and I'll poke at myself for a moment here. You asked me about skills once, and I thought you meant just like structured tags on people's profile about whether they're skilled in business development or not. This is a very early day where like I think you were the first person that I heard the term skills from. It was like probably 12 hours after Anthropic had launched new capabilities there. But I'm curious your view of like where skills come into play in data commerce, but also the analysis and some of the things that you're seeing there.
Yeah, I would say that skills are data, just like anything else that you might use at inference time. And Anthropic created the open standard of skills. They're just text files, but within those text files, there's information, and that information is structured in a way so that it can be easily accessed within AI tools like Claude at runtime, so that within the context window, when Claude gets a request from a user, it includes, by the way, we have this concept of skills. This is a list of all the skills that currently exist. And if you need to access any of that content, let us know, us being that agentic loop, the actual machine that's wrapping Claude, and I'll read them to you. And it allows Claude to determine, of the data that's available to me, I might have MCP tools. There's also this concept of skills. They're not too fundamentally different between the two because all it is just text that gets converted to tokens for a language model. But it's a way to be able to structure knowledge and distribute it through these different model providers ecosystems. Anthropic, from our perspective, has the best skill distribution mechanism for the enterprise and individuals through their plugin marketplace to be able to curate this content. So again, it's just data, and then distribute it to a large user base at scale so that when Claude is doing work on behalf of a person or even on behalf of another agent, that this content has been curated and accessible to them so that if Claude needs to invoke it at runtime, it can. And that just is because there's nothing fundamentally special about skills, but because of the adoption, the distribution mechanism that they have so that it's always mounted within the agentic loop at runtime, it becomes a very powerful tool that you can use skills to allow Claude to know something about how to build a financial model generically. And so you might see Claude for Financial Services has their financial modeling skill, but you might then say at an organization level, we don't want to use the single skill that Anthropic has built for the entire industry of finance that might need a financial model. We have an opinionated way in which we want to do financial modeling. So let's take some of the best practices on how they interact with the Excel Office.js interface, create models there. And then let's also add additional context for how we want to do financial modeling internally so that we have more of a specific way that we want Claude to be thinking about it when a user invokes that skill within either Claude for Excel or even Claude PowerPoint, Claude Cowork, because that distribution mechanism of that skill is built into all of those different interfaces that users are using. So that's an example where you might have a custom skill within an organization, but you can also have cross organizational skills. So you, Dan, can create a skill for how you think a user should be running an interview within a KOL, within an expert network conversation, or a skill to be able to analyze an expert network API, or how to evaluate expert network data providers that encapsulate your expertise, and you then can distribute that to other users via a skill using the Anthropic Marketplace. And so I see this as a very intuitive concept. All it is text files, but they do have concepts like progressive disclosure, so that you want just one skill file that might be 250 characters, but a bunch of other subdirectories inside of that, and either subdirectories inside of that, and you can even embed tools within a skill. And so a skill can have high-level context that almost acts like an index of more nuanced capabilities that are encapsulated within that skill. But then it might even have tools that skill can call out to if it's being invoked and has the ability to maybe execute a Python function or a TypeScript function to start doing work and discover. And it's a burgeoning mechanism that Anthropic is really pushing forward. The fact that it's natively available in the plugin marketplace, which is accessible within all of the different Anthropic interfaces, is something that's going to have a lot of legs. And I think it'll be interesting to see things that we ask ourselves. Are skills monetizable? And if you assume that data is monetizable and all skills are data at the end of the day, that it should be expected that skills will be monetizable in some mechanism.
I think Mercor is already trying to monetize them in many ways. The fact that they're paying so much for lawyers to create, trademark applications that are out of whole cloth, and doctors to transcribe notes that just based on examples. I think those are all. That's a direction that most large annotators are taking is trying to monetize skills.
Well, here I was picturing the skills section on the resume. Yeah, but I think when you think about like the human analog for skills, it goes back to that like experience, expertise, influence side of things, and what is monetizable also isn't always like clear and defined. So what makes an effective influencer like is something that's really hard to define. But when I think about, I like to think that I'm skilled in some things as a person. I probably am not very good at monetizing all of that. Some of that monetization is in the form of my career. So whether that's pitching myself for a job and going through an interview process and getting the job and then getting paid to do that job, I am getting paid to bring those skills and to
Yeah.
further develop those skills. Other like independent consultants, I think, deal with this all the time. But there's still a business development component that goes into that, and so yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see with skills in this AI context where it is providing that context. I use the word context twice in a sentence there. Like it is contextualizing what actually needs to be done and the know-how of how to do that. Which I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine a lot of that right now is monetized through the form of consultants and the people who are developing those skills. But long term, it'll be really interesting to see what is the value that's ascribed to those. Is there a marketplace? Because there will be availability, and there will be a transparency as part of that. It'll be interesting to see how we align on like what's the market price for a skill.
I think there was a recent study the question started out, are you concerned about AI taking your job? And like 44% of people said yes, it's great. And then the question was, what job will AI take? And like 53% reported that it would take white collar workers' jobs first. I think that's probably largely going to be true. There is some element when you say independent consultants, their skills might be, or when as I inferred it, independent consultants, their skills might be first in line for target. I actually think it's those people at the law firms or the hedge fund analysts and stuff like that that have this like very specific trained skill that is likely to be replicated first. I think the people that are like us that have gone out and on our own and have all these soft skills is very hard to replicate. But white collar workers, certainly those that are leveraging trained skills, can certainly be replicated very quickly.
Yeah. And I actually didn't take it that the consultants are first on the chopping block. I actually took it more that consultants are first on the front door of taking advantage of this.
No, yeah, that'd be where and apologies if I
No,
Yeah.
explain that right. Like I think that I was relating it to consultants because they specifically have to like they're the ones who are tasked with defining their skills. Like you go and you get a job, you interview once, maybe you go through 5 up to somehow I've had a 12-round interview process. A company not to be named, you know who you are. Uh, uh, and then you get the job and you're kind of there and you might be constantly evaluated, but like a consultant is constantly trying to figure out their next opportunity to commercialize that and really has to, I think the bar is a lot higher for the amount of work that they do. And by consultant, I'm just referring to people who are like working with multiple clients, like not management consulting as an industry group, because I probably put some of that work more into that white collar job category that is facing a lot of pressure. But yeah, I think that those people, but like one of the things that they've all been seeking for years is the forum. And just going back to my early experience in like expert networks, like there is still not a great forum out there for independent consulting. There have been many different attempts. There are all sorts of types of platforms that came and went. And I'm not referring to expert networks. Like expert networks are pretty defined workflow and platform, but for independent consultants in particular, they're still out there kind of like hunting for their next business. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for them to be the first one in line.
A couple things that I want to touch on that. In the same way that you want agents to evaluate data sets, you need agents to evaluate skills. Like, is this skill actually something that's going to move the needle in my workflow? And it's likely going to be a skill that moves the needle more so than just a new data set. And oftentimes it's going to be coupled together. So you might have a data set and a skill coupled, but you don't even need the data set to move the needle for an analyst working with an agent, specifically within co-work. you need a better skill or context on what to do there. So like the most valuable thing to be able to acquire oftentimes will be a skill. And to say that also like is the W-2 or is the consultant first on the chopping block, I actually think it's SaaS that's first on the chopping block as a function of skills, because skills don't have to inherently just be context. They can include software. They can include a tremendous amount of software, actually. And skills can be coupled together with domain skills and technical skills. So if you know how to understand a business workflow, and then there's a technical skill for how you build out UI and Databricks and what integrations look like, and you define a custom workflow for let's say a life sciences early drug evaluation process with a really good Databricks skill and like a good skill associated with maybe 2 or 3 pharma and uh, drug sales data vendors, that collective package is gonna knock the lights out of some of like the large data providers in that space that are trying to push a SaaS model. But that's just on the asset management side. Do you say the same thing for dental software or booking software or CRMs? They get sliced and diced in a million ways.
Look, I am not a technical founder, although I have a little bit of technical skills. I got frustrated with my CRM a couple weeks ago, and overnight I went to Cursor and I coded up a new CRM that is more efficient than what I have now, what I pay for now.
Totally.
Dan and I were talking about when you asked about go to market, to circle back. I've given a lot of thought to product-led growth versus, founder sales. I'm at that pre-seed stage where we're doing a lot of founder sales, but that will transition, God willing, into, having a sales team maybe. But I really think that vibe coding and agents and the decline in SaaS model, as a viable method, I think that will lead to product-led growth being a later stage go-to-market strategy, because there's just so many products now, and the first thing that somebody's going to look at when they look at your product is, can I replicate this myself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like PLG and even SaaS, I think historically, despite that they got a lot of press and an insane amount of venture funding and evaluations along the way, they were concepts that weren't ever really defined. So even like the idea of SaaS is dead. I always like to break it down further, like what you described as workflows. And a lot of the largest SaaS companies, I'll use CRMs. So like, for example, it's like talk to any salesperson at any company.
Right.
And ask them if they like the way that their CRM is set up.
Right.
And a lot of that actually isn't the CRM provider. It's that, who's in charge of the CRM?
Right.
And do they even understand how the sales motions work? Do they understand how the company works? Like, do they understand how accounting works? And so what I think will be really interesting is like, if it's skills that solve this, is like, do they solve that kind of know-how? Because when you go and you buy a new CRM system, what you're not provided with is someone who can spend even 15 minutes with you and tell you like, hey, by the way, don't do it that way. Like this is how to do it correctly. I know a lot of those companies think that they provide that service, but you spend 50 grand on a CRM for your company. The first thing they'll do is they'll recommend a consultant who costs another 50 grand on top of it. And now all of a sudden your like total cost of ownership is double what you thought it was. And so that to me is a market that I think gets broken apart, not necessarily because workflows aren't important. Those companies could be the ones to develop these skills and could be at the forefront of monetizing these skills, but where like half their valuation has come from inefficiencies that they've been the ones to create and have no incentive to solve. We talked about this with compute. The large cloud companies really don't have any incentive to help you save money on your compute bill. Like they make so much off of it, but there's this massive industry that's formed around that to help people manage their cloud spend. And so, I think that SaaS as a concept is to this day, as we're talking, like you go on any network, any media thing, they talk about SaaS, but SaaS is such a widely defined concept that if you ask 10 people what their definition of SaaS is, you're probably going to get 10 different answers. But I think when you break it down further, there's a potential tremendous opportunity that I personally hadn't really thought of until this conversation around, could those companies be the ones to actually define those workflows in an AI world, and just stop this rhetoric of like, oh well, no one really wants to vibe code their own CRM. Like the past 2 quarters of earnings calls, I don't think it's because Anthropic announced something new that all those stocks got hammered the other week. Like, I'm going to give a very bold take here, and happy to talk with any investors who invest in these markets. But like, the real reason is because these companies don't have a strategy, or they haven't communicated that effectively to the street. Like, they are just trying to play defense and say, we are not impacted by AI because either we have proprietary data and the market sees right through it that they don't, or their definition of proprietary is a whole other issue. Or they just say, it's not going to happen that quickly. And then, but there are people who are looking at a long-term thesis, and they're like, well, I'm looking at you 5 years out, and like, I don't care if it happens tomorrow or it happens 3 years from now. In my 5-year window that I'm looking at as a potential like private equity investor, for example, it's going to have a 5 to 7 year horizon. I'm not very bullish on this business. So I think, and I'm not an IR consultant. I'm not the guru for public company communications, but to me, a lot of the rhetoric actually distills down to like, is there actually a strategy in this AI world that makes logical sense, or are people just hoping that they can kind of sneak by? And if the public markets have proven anything in the past few weeks, it's like you can't hide.
Well, and I think that if you already have an existing customer base, you're ahead of a company that doesn't.
Yeah.
And if you can think, what is the way that you can take advantage of a growing adoption of agentic tools in the enterprise and a increased capability from AI understanding within that workforce, and you already have a lot of their data, you don't have to have them think, how do I replace this tool? It can be more so, how do you actually take this tool and get 10x more value on top of it? And if you already have that existing distribution, you have a huge leg up over a startup that has none, and you already have at least some data model around it. And so I totally see the same thing.
At the most basic level, you have a direct line to the customer.
Right.
Like, you can ask them what they think about things, but you need to act on that feedback and take that feedback back and redefine your strategy off of it, which I think is what a lot of people just aren't doing right now.
And then how much does it come back to what you were saying earlier, Freeman, on consumption-based pricing, right? Like, if you can have an agent evaluate, hey, not only is this a good skill, but it's also a really good data model, and there actually is good deterministic software built into this system that handles CRM, or it handles accounting, or it handles certain workflows for me. I don't have to build and maintain all of that myself. I'll have my agent interact with it and then integrate it with other workflows as it needs fit. We don't have to re-engineer the whole wheel, because there is still an element of servicing debt as it pertains to owning something internally, that even if you have agents that can do that for you, like, there's still debt that you take on every additional piece of software that you're responsible for maintaining.
Well, I think that's why Claude is doing so well in some of these spaces that are falling flat, in the sense that they're integrating with, maybe not the Westlaws and the LexisNexuses and those types of businesses. Those, assuming, my assumption is that AI within some of these SaaS models is probably the biggest lock-in, especially if you're going to charge on a per token basis or on a credit basis. So I think that Claude especially has done a really good job, and Anthropic has done a really good job in going out to these companies that they're otherwise going to crush, and say, hey, why don't we integrate our tools within your workflows?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, like, there's when you look at how many data sets go into like a Bloomberg terminal, or CapIQ, or FactSet Workstation, there's so much data going in there. But I think this is where people need to understand, like, what is actually proprietary data that can be just captured directly, and what's not. And historically, I mean, not even that long ago, if you wanted 13F filings, someone had to go down to the SEC's office of record keeping and ask for the filing, and probably scan it in, and then it got sent somewhere else, and that person typed it into a computer, and then it became available. So when it costs $30,000 to get a feed of 13Fs, it made sense. Like that was the cost of goods sold, and the value that it, not just the value that it drove, but like the cost of actually putting that together. Now, I mean, pre-AI, that's already, there's XBRL and all these other standards out there for financial filings overall that have made that available. But I think it's making a lot of companies look back at what is actually proprietary, or where they've truly done something that makes it more unique. Uh, what is the general availability of that data? And those are like with anything in any product area, those are two of the key things that are going to determine the market price,
But
or the price that you can charge, not necessarily a market if you are the only one that provides it.
yeah, zooming out on sort of back to the ICP of who the data buyer is, and sort of like uh, the it's interesting the rise of AI as it relates to the changing nature, changing demographic of the workforce. You and I I'm 35 now. I'm like in the prime of being in the workforce, and um, my father is retiring, and he's never going to use AI in his workspace. But probably, um, I would probably by this time, if I'm not using AI, I'd behind. And there would probably be an automated solution to a lot of the workflow that we're using, even if it wasn't LLMs. And LLMs have been great and has driven adoption. But what I'm trying to get at is the changing nature of the workforce has really been driven in tandem with like the adoption of AI in the in the workspace, especially for your example. People our age probably wouldn't be willing to go down to the SEC and get all the filings. We would just probably work on something else, right? And now we don't have to go down to the SEC and get the filings. We can do something else.
Well, with that, Freeman, Dan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks
And for everyone tuning in, thanks for joining for another episode of the Hedge Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Michael Watson. We try to post as much as we can. You can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, or we're always on LinkedIn. And until the next episode, we will catch you later.